Good evening, everybody, and welcome to PechaKucha Dubai. I'm Mark Dytham, and I'm the founder of PechaKucha. So it's great to welcome you to the city's 24th volume, and it's really amazing to be connecting with you all. I'm based in Tokyo, and through fantastic technology, we can all connect together. The pandemic has brought a big shock to the world. Everything went on pause, and it's amazing that there is a silver lining that we can all connect together like this virtually, not only in Dubai, but around the PechaKucha cities around the world. So if you could go to my next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about PechaKucha and what's going on. So PechaKucha started in Tokyo in 2003. Oh, they went quickly. Oh, they went super quick. Anyway, let's hold on that slide. That's fine. Oh, go back one more. If you can, that's it. Thank you. So PechaKucha started in Tokyo, and PechaKucha means the sound of chit chat in Japanese. And it started off as a one-off event, and it has spread all around the world. And amazingly, today we're in 1,235 cities, including Dubai, and we love Dubai. Thank you so much for being a fantastic PechaKucha supporter and holding 24 volumes in your city. And we'd love to come and see you in person one day soon. So everything was amazing. We have about 100 events around the world, and that's where we were in February. We came to March, and suddenly all of the events disappeared, and we had to scramble and think what to do. So on April the 9th, we held our first virtual PechaKucha, and we called it Inspire. We found during these big issues around the world, we've had the big earthquake in Japan and tsunami, and we ran this event called Inspire. We wanted the world to inspire Japan at that moment. And it was really successful. And there were lots of really creative and interesting things that happened during this very difficult moment. So we thought that we would try and inspire the world this time with this global pandemic. And we've held over 100 virtual events around the world. Over 1,000 speakers have spoken. And we have an amazing archive. So please check that out on PechaKucha.com. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome all of the speakers tonight and wish you all a really fantastic PechaKucha night, volume 24. And I'm really interested to hear about your theme tonight, which is Metamorphosis. So over to you. I'd like to welcome the first speaker.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm just going to jump in before all the speakers. Many of you might know me. I'm a director at El Cercal. Thank you, Mark, for your inspiring introduction. We are very lucky to have you as the founder of PechaKucha here with us tonight. Metamorphosis is a subject that resonated greatly with myself personally, and I assume with many of our audience members this evening. Like you mentioned, I think since COVID-19, this kind of paralysis that we've experienced of the entire world, but then also the events that followed after, Black Lives Matter, the explosion in Beirut, to mention a few, I think we all experienced this metamorphosis and almost this kind of alterations on individual, but also collective scales. And I think these transformations, scripting situations all felt complex, uncertain, unknown, absurd at times, certainly something that we could call Kafkaesque times that we are living in currently. Probably many of us read Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis back in high school or our college years, maybe even recently. And I'm not sure if many of you know, but actually Kafka refused an illustration for the Metamorphosis book that would have portrayed its main character, Gregor Samsa, as a literal beetle or a bedbug. He said, the insect itself cannot be drawn. It cannot be drawn even as if seen from a distance. And so I think it only reconfirms that metamorphosis is not just a literal representation of change or simply transformation, but a philosophical concept stemming from existentialism. And so with this, I would like to present our speakers who will be attempting to make their own illustration, their visual illustration of metamorphosis from various disciplines, practices, and life experiences. Each one of them will have 20 slides and 20 seconds per slide to share those stories. I will quickly give an introduction of each speaker. We'll start with Nancy Zabaneh, who is founder at Darshan and Kundalini yoga teacher and trainer, wellness mentor, who is a pioneer in physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual fitness in the Arab world and beyond. We then will continue with Rami El-Ali, who is an assistant professor of philosophy and coordinator of the philosophy program at the Lebanese American University. We will then continue PechaKucha with Tanya, and now I hope I get your last name right, Ursomarzo, who great, who is an architect and multidisciplinary designer whose creative work centers on design, construction of space and objects in response to our bodies, and who is currently a professor of architecture at American University of Sharjah. We'll then continue with Amina Bensouda, who is a singer and a songwriter based between Paris and Morocco, and will lead us through her point of view as a musician. Then we will continue with Dr. Cliff Lauson, who's been a senior curator at Hayward Gallery in London since 2009 and has commissioned and produced numerous exhibitions since. Mahnaz Fancy, who manages Sharjah Architecture Triennial and was raised in Karachi, Paris, Abu Dhabi, and New York, will lead us through her personal journey tonight, and who's managed organizations of not-profit organizations focused on art and social change for the past 20 years. We will then continue our presentations with Tausif Noor, who is a writer and curator based in Philadelphia. He is the former Spiegel-Wilks Curatorial Fellow at the ICA in Philadelphia, and his writing can be found in publications such as Artforum, Frieze, Art Asia Pacific, and others, to name a few. And we will then conclude our evening with Toral, Gajarawala. I rehearsed your last name many times before tonight, whom we are very excited to have from who is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at NYU Abu Dhabi, and so presents from a kind of literature point of view. Toral is also the author of Untouchable Fictions, Literary Realism, and the Crisis of Caste. And so without further ado, I will allow Nancy to lead this discussion and presentations of PechaKucha, this chit chat further. Nancy, are you with us?
Thank you very much, Vilma. All set. The world around us is constantly changing. As humans, we get trapped in the Maya, the domain of the planet, of time and space, and the distorted illusion of the permanence it produces. The past isn't here anymore. The future cannot be seen. The only thing permanent is the present moment. Precious moments, the weather, wins, losses, even a human life everything is temporary. Day turns into night, birth precedes death, even atoms die after serving their purpose. We hear it over and over, live your life in the moment without worrying about the future. Everything will change tomorrow. The best way to accept change is to flow with it. Train your brain to be flexible enough to accept things for exactly how they are. Do not be afraid to look at the present for what it is. Look it in the eye and feel the changes even as the boat rocks and reels through the storm. The Buddhists teach that we are made up of little deaths. This means that we die every moment and are born at the same time as well. The greatest of all impermanence is death. We're born, we live, and then one day we die in this human form. Each night is an opportunity to practice death, let go of the world, to leave behind our attachments. Do not force things. Once you learn to accept that change is the only constant in life, you stop doing that. You begin to understand that this sort of pressure creates a block in your energy, which holds you back from reaching out to opportunities that are worthy of your attention. Gratitude for each and every moment is a recognition that if you don't live this moment completely, it can all be gone in the blink of an eye. When we're more grateful, we become more connected to and appreciative of the world around us. You can train your mind to be ready to face any situation that demands change in you and the environment in which you live. You can actually become better at living life and less overwhelmed when the changes emerge. To develop the neutral mind is not to avoid or deny the tension of the polarities, but to feel the push and pull of them remaining calm in the center. I often ask people if they have a system to instruct their minds to serve spirit. If not, mind's default state is to serve our instincts. The practice of Kundalini yoga, for example, creates a fertile interaction between the spirit and the mind and body that are meant to serve it. The evolutionary nature of the universe ensures that we will grow and be transformed. Free will is the gift that we humans were given to make changes in our lives. In each and every moment, we have the opportunity to participate in the process of that change through conscious choice. We're both part of the universe and the universe itself. With the help of a steady spiritual practice, we can move beyond fear of change and the suffering that goes with it and live in the light of our highest consciousness. I change myself, my thoughts, my energy, my projection, because every challenge leads back to me. I'm a spirit being having a human experience. The strength of spirit lies inside of me. But because of our forgetful nature as humans, we quickly fall into the identity that is connected to our egos, the social programming, the complexes. A daily practice makes all the difference. You can tap into that strength. You have the capacity to link moment to moment, breath by breath, to the flow of spirit. For each of us, the toolbox may be different. For me, it's when I practice Kundalini yoga, when I dance with abandon, when I light a candle in a sacred space, when I meditate. During this time of radical change, it is important to connect with the identity that is liberated from the complexes, free from self-deprecation, free from the conceptual thinking mind, the foundation that makes up the best version of yourself. Develop your capacity to witness. Learn to name and label the feelings that arise in you. Have the courage to be vulnerable. And if you're feeling fearful, name it. Recognize that your fear is a mental projection that arises from remembering the past or projecting into an unknown and imagined future. The storm will hit. The floods will come. This is the time to ask, is my life built on strong, sturdy foundations? When things are going well, we rarely take the time to question. It is in adversity that we learn to stop, pause, and reflect. What were the constructs of my house before this pandemic? Before I lost my job? Before my city went up in flames? Is my value system where it needs to be? What could I be doing differently in my life? How can I serve? In Eastern practices, one of the cornerstones of awakening is adversity. As an individual and as part of a larger collective. What if you were to train yourself to become aware of the presence that is inseparable from who you are? You needed the adversity to deepen that realization. Life serves up circumstances that we do not choose. Be open to change. We can arm ourselves with the tools to keep us uplifted, with grace, with endurance, helping to release us from victimization, to establish a new identity, to develop a sense of individuality, and to evolve into a powerful, independent force. You are the creator of your own life. You create your reality by altering your thoughts, your words, your actions. There is no better time to become a conscious participant in the creation of your life. Enjoy life liberated without attachments. Once you detach yourself from this life and the way things should be, you attach it to yourself and to your purpose. You then have no other option but to bloom. Being in a state of surrender means being open to any change. Handing over to Rami. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Okay, well, I'm going to bracket Beirut's current reality in favor of what I hope will be a brighter future. What I want to talk to you about today is the value of the virtual, and more specifically, the value of virtual reality, which I believe will be a significant part of our future. Let me start by defining the virtual as any item generated with the help of a computing device and its display. There can be virtual persons, worlds, objects, events, and actions. Virtual reality, or VR, is a bit different than the virtual more broadly. Virtual reality produces a sense of presence, a concept I'm going to come back to. For now, the way it does this is with the help of a head-mounted display, like the one that you see in the picture, and future devices might simply transmit information directly to your retina. Now, I think that many have this idea that the virtual is less valuable than the non-virtual, and that all virtual items are of homogeneous value. I want to convince you that this idea is wrong. The virtual can operate in at least 3 distinct ways, and these have distinct types of value. VR will add to all 3. First, the virtual can operate as a representation of the non-virtual. Here, we see a virtual representation of Nefertari's tomb, and this represents the real tomb. It isn't the real tomb, nor something purely virtual. It's rather a virtual representation of a non-virtual space. Second, the virtual can simply be a new context for the non-virtual. This talk you're listening to is not a representation of a talk. It is the talk. Similarly, Mary Poppins and Bert in the scene are having a conversation in the painting. It's not a painted conversation. In these cases, the virtual is just a new context for reenacting the non-virtual. Finally, the virtual can be purely virtual in the same way the fictional can be purely fictional. In Rick and Morty, the plumbus is neither a non-fictional item, nor does it represent one. It's something purely fictional, and in the VR experience, something purely virtual. Interactions with it have no counterpart in the non-virtual world. Now, VR adds to the virtual by also inducing this sense of presence in a virtual space. We can characterize the sense of presence technically, but also do so less technically. On a screen, a giant doesn't require that you tilt your head up to see it, and an ant doesn't require tilting your head down. But in VR, you do have to tilt your head up or down to see what's above and below you. So the sense of scale is retained in VR. Effectively, this makes VR a more embodied experience than normal dealings with the virtual. Here you can see this visual artist in Beirut, Carla Habib, using a pedestal to reach the top of the wall she's graffitiing. This is something she'd never have to do when virtually painting on a screen. Finally, VR collapses the distance between the virtual image and the non-virtual world. Usually, virtual items are locked to the screen, but in VR, they seem to be items around you, either part of your non-virtual world in augmented reality or a separate virtual world in virtual reality. Because it induces this sense of presence, VR expands the scope of the virtual. Take art as an example. Some forms of virtual art represent non-virtual forms of art. In the game Dreams, you can represent virtual building and architecture without building. You don't need to lay down any bricks. But in the VR version, you can also do this while retaining the sense of scale a building has. VR also offers more contexts for the non-virtual. Recently, The Under Presents has offered an interactive theatrical performance of The Tempest. Here, the actors virtually perform the tempest by simply non-virtually performing the tempest. They and you are able to do this in an embodied way in a virtual space. Finally, VR enables new, purely virtual forms of art. In the Museum of Other Realities, you can enter a virtual comic book scene where the virtual comic involves 2D lines drawn in 3-dimensional space and where you are inside that virtual 2D space. VR comics are purely virtual because they don't have a non-virtual counterpart. You can't non-virtually draw 2D scenes in 3D space. VR will also contribute to new forms of virtual identity. On the one hand, your virtual self can simply represent yourself. It isn't you, it's simply a picture of you. This is the sort of thing you can get on Instagram, where the representations of you are not you. But in VR, your virtual self can simply involve being yourself, but in a virtual context. Here, you're not representing yourself virtually. Rather, you yourself recur in the virtual world, just as you recur when you're here in Beirut or there in Dubai or in Japan. Finally, you can have a purely virtual self. This will neither be a representation of your non-virtual self, nor will it map onto your non-virtual self. It's a new self that is more malleable and diverse than your real self or non-virtual self, because it's only constrained by the virtual world's physics. You can look into a mirror and see a whole host of different faces that look back as yours. Because the virtual can operate in these 3 ways, and VR adds to this with the sense of presence, VR will offer some interesting new possibilities and challenges in the future. Because we can experience ourselves as present in the virtual world, this might come at the expense of the non-virtual world. On the other hand, it can also make us aware of the non-virtual world by giving us a sense of presence in the non-virtual spaces we wouldn't be able to normally occupy. Similarly, it can bring us together or drift us further apart. In I'm a Man, you embody a Black sanitation worker during the protests leading to MLK Jr.'s assassination. But you can also have the rich and the poor literally occupying different virtual worlds. It can also allow us to lose sight of our identity or gain deeper insight into it. In the movie Avalon, a war rages on as the protagonists wonder which world is the real one, because they've created so many virtual worlds that can't be distinguished from the real one. By contrast, a person can come to better awareness of their identity, as occurs with embodied gender explorations in VR chat. Finally, because VR requires sensors that give fine-grained information about the user, they can track body movements and even eye movements, this can produce unprecedented levels of privacy invasion. This information can be used against us or in our favor to give us deeper insights into who we are. So where does this leave us? I think the sense of presence VR adds will show us that the world we've occupied so far has been relatively limited. In the future, we'll be able to occupy many virtual surroundings that represent, reenact, and add to the non-virtual world. But for this to be a positive metamorphosis, we need to be thinking right now about the value of the virtual, and in specific, the value of virtual reality. Thank you, and please welcome Tania next.
Thanks, Rami. Hi, everyone. I'm Tania Ursomarzo, and I'm an architect, designer, and design educator presently based in Sharjah and in New York City. My presentation is focused on one particular architectural project that I designed and built myself, which was one outcome of a larger body of ongoing work with sheet materials, in this case, 16-gauge mild steel. The project is called 7 Degrees and was completed between 2010 and 2012 and consisted of a series of 4 folded steel walls that were installed on the grounds of Cranbrook Art Museum and Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Cranbrook was designed by the Finnish architect Ellis between 1925 and 1942. Mainly, I'm going to expose my creative research and interests and the work that led to this project, because it was in the process of experimenting and studying what I was making and testing with sheet steel that the evolution and metamorphosis of the work actually lies. Now, to give you some background and context, I have a fascination with the inherent behavior and properties of materials and how the acts that we perform on them can lead to alchemical transformations of the material, as well as to discoveries and innovations in how we can design and make with them. And I'm particularly interested in thin, flat materials, what are typically referred to as sheet materials, because of their potential for dramatic metamorphosis. I'm fascinated by how something thin and flat, essentially formless and two-dimensional, can become something with complex three-dimensional form, volume, shape, and movement, and in ways almost unrecognizable from the original state of the material. So I'm interested in the transformation of flatness and thinness into fullness and thickness, and how that happens as a process of design and making. I'm also interested in how translation takes place in design, specifically how we translate from the 2D, such as lines and drawings, to the 3D, the physical things those lines and drawings make. In architecture and design, drawing, and more specifically line, is a form of abstraction and representation that helps us distill complex issues such as spatial configurations. And yet they have an actual physical implication or consequence, like they mean something in the three-dimensional world. I'm interested in the translation of the two-dimensional or representational line into the three-dimensional or physical line in architecture and design. For example, how a two-dimensional line or a two-dimensional cut can have a three-dimensional effect on the material that is beyond what we could have imagined or anticipated, and would have otherwise would not have otherwise been discovered without physically making the work. And so I embarked on an episodic and iterative experimentation process where I started developing an index of what I called sutures. The sutures are a series of laser-cut patterned lines across the surface of the steel sheet where material is removed. Once the sheet is edited, it is folded by hand as prescribed by the layout of sutures. The sutures began more focused on trying to create a continuous complex fold across a large surface, but as the studies evolved and discoveries were made, the sutures started extending across the face of the panel. The removal of material through a type of carefully calibrated suturing enables steel to fold in a controlled way. So engineering an index of incisions allowed me to explore the formal and structural relationship between cutting and folding and the material. Subtraction is therefore both the structure and the system directing the work. I realized that the suture, in other words, the two-dimensional drawing and its placement on the space of the material sheet, became a system that allows for the dialing of tension through the relationship of solid to void, meaning the presence of line versus the absence of line, or what is cut versus not cut. This relationship makes it possible to tune the intricacies of the suture in terms of how it affects or transforms the character of steel. The suture and the bend it creates when folded can make the edges of steel appear soft and fluid, for instance, a quality typically uncharacteristic of this material. The suture also allows the fold or corner to be open and to control the degree of aperture, to play with transparency and the ability to pass light and air. The fold is a critical part of the work as well because it gives the sheet both rigidity and form. It also permits a planar surface to tilt in both its vertical and horizontal axes simultaneously, which increases volume and the complexity of the form. By playing with the choreography of incision and fold, I could design thickness from thinness, and in a way that allows me to apply these material studies to space, or to study their impact as spatial elements in a site and within a larger context. So 7 Degrees became one manifestation or application of this fascination with sheet steel. 7 Degrees united my research in folding and the physical line with a condition of sight. Working off of a grid expanded from Alil Saranen's shifts in Cranbrook Academy of Arts campus design, the project unfolds as a series of lines extracted to structure a layout of 4 by 8 foot sheets of steel. For me, in the context of my creative work, Metamorphosis is about the alchemy of making and how you can capitalize on the unexpected. It's about working empirically and viscerally with the material and the process. The physical act of making and the knowledge it uncovers helps us to invent new creative and constructive possibilities for design. So to me, making is design. And even beyond that, on a more personal level, is my metamorphosis as a designer. Through this work, I discovered more about who I am creatively. How I think and how I make became more distilled. I think Denzel Hurley explained it best in his essay entitled About Making, when he says, "Making provides the fullest opportunity for experiencing the world. Its reality is one of continuing surprise and possibility. Through the activity of making, the world is a place for one's inner being, its existence and import to materialize as matter. Making is, therefore, a process by which we understand what is needed and appreciated and why. Thank you very much for listening, and I will now turn the stage over to Amina Bensouda.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation with all the great souls you are. I'm Amina. I'm a singer-songwriter. I was born and raised in Morocco, and I've been living in Paris for the past decade. And I'm going to tell you about my own metamorphosis in terms of creation and regarding this critical period that we are all experiencing. As a musician and singer, my job is to go outside and meet the crowds and sing for people. And this is like the core sense of what I love about my music. But with the pandemic, everything's just closed. I mean, every festival, every venues, every bars simply just closed their doors, and leaving the art community in a kind of emptiness and shock states. And I figured, what was left for us to do as musicians? We've seen incredible initiative all around the world that started in Italy, where people gathered on their balcony to start just playing music with their neighbors. And this was very moving because it reminded us that nothing unites people quite like music. But what happens at some point when the light turns off? You played on your balcony and you're stuck at home, and you just like trying to figure out what to do during this period. I mean, if you have a home, you're lucky enough, but still. A lot of questions popped in my head at that time. And because I flew to Morocco a few days before the lockdown, and my plan was to meet musicians, was to work on my songs with musicians and eventually start recording with them. But with everything being canceled, I felt, like everyone, pretty stuck. I felt I was walking like this woman in a very blurry path. I didn't know what was ahead. And it made me a few weeks before I just realized that it was a great opportunity for me, because what was left for me to do then just work on my album by myself. And this was not planned, but I did. I actually started writing and started playing my songs, started playing what actually came out of me at that time, digging to some old stuff that I wrote in the past. And of course, I played a lot. I tried a lot of melodies, different chords, different progressions. And that's the thing with creation. I think it's a metamorphosis in itself, from the first idea you have in mind to the final song or final project, whatever discipline is that actually comes alive. So I started, I started deconstructing the song with the chords and trying to figure out what did I want to hear, what I was hearing in my head above the guitar and my voice. And so I got this software and I started digging. I started, of course, recording my guitar, my voice, and then adding different layers to the songs. And this was a very, very interesting phase because it's very experimental. I mean, you add some saxophone, you add some piano, you add a bass, you add different sounds that could best accompany the songs I was making. And once the mock-up was ready, I had to find someone who could help me make this album come alive. And funnily enough, I used Instagram and internet to connect with different people that were stuck like me and were seeking for projects. And I met this incredible musician and producer on Instagram, Camille Canouni, who helped me make this album come alive. I mean, we worked on specific things on my songs, and eventually the album is now ready and it is going to come out soon in a few weeks. So it's surprisingly quite productive year for me. But the thing is now that the album is going to come alive, I mean, how am I going to promote it? And that's the thing. I mean, regarding of social media, being on Spotify and Rami, iTunes, etc. I mean, the way artists, I mean, musicians mostly promote their sound is by touring. And it seems like we're not going back to normal anytime soon. And festivals are not all opened, and the bars and the small stages are not available now. But there are different directions that are interesting to see how the industry is actually shifting. I mean, during the lockdown and right after, we've seen a lot of artists going on live, going on Instagram, Zoom, YouTube, trying to connect with their fan base and trying to keep the link with them. And it's funny to see how it's being organized. I mean, it started being casually recorded with a smartphone. Then we've seen artists shaking virtual chip jars on the internet. Others with bigger means, working on their sceneries, the lightning. So it's all being very organized. And there are also platforms today that actually sell tickets for people to buy and attend a concert from the comfort of their apartments. So it's something that, for me, is kind of scary because I want to meet people. I want to go back on stage. But it's also interesting to see how well-established artists like Erykah Badu, who I admire and respect very much, is now even attracting people into her very own platform. She doesn't use Instagram, she doesn't use Zoom, and she's actually using her own platform to communicate and interact with her fans. So the change is definitely here. I mean, whether we like it or not, I'm not sure we're going back to normal anytime soon. And I think as artists and musicians, we have to take the lead into this to make sure we don't miss it. Thank you very much. Handing over to Cliff.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. No worries. This is like a change log, a kind of visual diary in a way, kind of artistic response to the first 6 months of the year. So examples from art and life, but also time and space. So the first example is Song Dong's Writing with Water. And it's from a series of ephemeral works using Chinese calligraphy, but he uses water instead of ink. So the writing actually evaporates over time. And the messages are chosen carefully due to censorship in China, where Song Dong is from. But the words have this ephemeral quality to them. Corey Archangel also has a writing project. So he's a post-internet artist, so-called, but he publishes these source codes. And the reason he does them in print and paper is so that they can survive changes in technology as well as catastrophic events. This is the film 12 Monkeys, a still from the film, directed by Terry Gilliam, starring Bruce Willis, who's right there. But it's a film about catastrophe, specifically a global pandemic. And Willis's character, he's sent back in time to learn about the virus's origins. And he is killed at an airport, chase scene in pursuit of an evil scientist. And it's inspired by La Jetée by Chris Marker. And as in the sort of modern adaptation, there's a time traveler paradox built into the original, which is a photo roman. At airports, most of the airlines have grounded most of their fleets, but airplanes continue to fly, like even at the start of lockdown, completely empty of passengers. First, in order to keep time slots at airports, which is a sort of bizarre thing, and also for ghost flights, just so they could keep the plane serviceable, they flew them empty. The kind of idea of vacancy reminds me of Lamia Gargash's photo project, where she documents one-star hotels, largely in Dubai. But many of these hotels, of course, have been empty for months and months. The artist asks, sort of, what is a space and a place? Isa Genskin's Window. This is an exhibition that was cut short due to the pandemic. And like many of her works, it features an assemblage of parts, and here just the emptiness of a plane. Leads on to the private jet suite of Toronto's eye candy pop-up. So this is an experience-based pop-up museum, and it's a new phenomenon that blends selfie culture, interior design, and entertainment. Which leads on to a still from a film work by a Finnish artist, Pilvi Takala. So she's here dressed as Snow White. She's being refused entry to Disneyland because only children may enter Disneyland dressed as characters, not grown-ups. So in the film, she's escorted off of the premises by security. Here's a sculpture by Franz West, German artist. He makes larger-than-life sculpture. This was for Documenta in 2011. And it includes these seats from which to observe this spiky ball structure. And it was intended as a parody of a reverent art experience. So coronavirus's molecular composition makes it susceptible to everyday hand soap. But back in 2015, infrared hand soap dispensers, along with other things like fitness trackers and heart rate monitors, were discovered not to activate with darker skin tones, and it revealed a racial bias embedded in industrial product design. Another show that was cut short during the pandemic was Kara Walker's monumental fountain in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern, addressing, of course, histories of empire and slavery, and uncannily foreshadowing this increased massive visibility and global debate around public monuments. One such monument in Bristol, statue of the slave trader Edward Colston, was thrown into the river, into the canal during protests. A week later, YBA artist Mark Quinn, against the mayor's wishes and to everyone's surprise, erected his own statue of a Black Lives Matter protester, which was promptly removed. Change the Museum is there's an Instagram account that pressures US museums to move beyond lip service proclamations by amplifying tales of unchecked racism. Another Instagram account is the Artist Support Pledge, and it's a disruptive project during the pandemic that sort of bypasses gallerists and dealers, going straight to artists. And to date, over $62 million US have been sold. Worth of artwork has been sold through that channel. So this is Elm Greenman Drag Set's Statue of Liberty, which is an ATM machine embedded in a section of Berlin Wall. So it's a sort of monument to this huge structure that was in the way of everything, but is now obsolete, much like the cash point is going to be in a cashless economy. This is Lucy Orta's Nexus Architecture, and her interest is in functional textiles, so the social fabric. And all these people, of course, wearing this fabric are forced into a grid of, in a way, somewhat social distancing. A decade before Kara Walker was in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern, this was Dominique Gonzalez Forster's dystopian installation of a futuristic catastrophe. So this is the world in 2058 during an endless flood. And there's bunk beds for sheltering, overgrown artworks, and in the background, clips from La Jetée. This is a fiberglass bench by Tyler Coburn, which he made in consultation with paleoanthropologists, biologists, genetic engineers, and its prediction, the bench is based on what he thinks the shape of our bodies will be in the future. So the idea is that in many years, a gallery goer might unexpectedly meet themselves by sitting on the perfect receptacle for their backside. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Mahnaz.
Mahnaz, are you with us?
Sorry, I'm here. I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Cliff. Hi. So most of you probably know me in my professional capacity at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial. But today, I'm really here to speak in a more personal voice. Over the last 6 months, the Triennial initiated a series of podcasts on Gulf cities. And I recognize that while my work currently focuses on how architecture and urbanism influence our lives, it also reflects the questions that have shaped my life and worldview. This is the same worldview that has been kind of really checked or come to a grinding halt thanks to the coronavirus. So when I was invited to join this PechaKucha program, I looked up what metamorphosis meant and how it related to coronavirus. So metamorphosis is defined in the OED as where a change of the form or nature of a thing or a person. And I then started looking at the various literary references where metamorphosis appears, and we see it across Western literature and in some of our favorites, including The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland. But for me, the literary expressions of metamorphosis that particularly resounded were the ones in post-colonial literature from Tayyip Saleh, Salman Rushdie, and our own UAE author, Deepak Unnikrishnan. What is it about this kind of migration story that I, as a South Asian, essentially belong to? It's centuries of movement. It's centuries of changing identities. And it's something that my family belongs to. My family, which has roots all over the world, runs in those circuits, lived in East Africa and then Karachi, came from Turkey and Uzbekistan and ended up in Kashmir. I'm an intermingling creature, someone much like the city of Karachi that I was born in, where the built environment shows you a history of colonialism and the optimism of young modern nations after they were made independent from colonialism. And this is the same story I see in, and I'm sorry about this horrible image. It's an image of a work that I showed in the first exhibition I curated, Rashid Rana's What is So Pakistani About This Painting? And you see on a background of Indian cotton, which was at the core of colonialism, the title was written in Arabic script, and the title was, What is So Pakistani About This Painting? In a way, this is the question I ask. What is so Pakistani about my story? Well, my Pakistani story begins with a war between India and Pakistan in 1970, the same war that led to the secession of Bangladesh. My story of migration begins with that too. And my family left Karachi with two things that really anchored us, the paintings that my family owned. One by Chughtai, one by Sadikan. And these we carried to our various homes. The first home after Karachi was in Paris. And at 3, I walk into my little French nursery, and according to my mother, come out speaking French. An accumulation of languages is one of the ways that I have metamorphosized or changed or shifted. Soon after, we arrived in Abu Dhabi. This is Abu Dhabi in 1979, a very different landscape than the one we live in today. But it's also one where, as an accident of history, I was in a lycée with children of Iranian and Lebanese immigrants who were there, accidents of history and politics, just as I was. Soon thereafter, we moved to New York. I was about 10, and America is a very different story. And I think I recognized it immediately. I remember being in a classroom in my first year and realizing that suddenly the multicultural world that I lived in Abu Dhabi was no longer there. It took me a while to understand and learn the history and how to look at it. And when I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, I just love this picture because I miss that place. I really began to look at the history. And armed with these various tools, whether it's language or critical tools, I found myself in the field of comparative literature. It's a field that was really founded by Gramsci and really is for people who are exiled or have immigrated. And oops, this suddenly slipped in. And I found a way to make sense of that until 9/11, another kind of political event that forced a metamorphosis in many ways. Outside events have a way of shaping us. 9/11 and 5 years later, my father's death all changed my world. And again, I come back to a painting. This is a work by Zarina Hashmi, The Atlas of My World. Again, you see the use of transliteration as a means of ownership or laying claim. And I feel like this is what I do. And in many ways, finding my life in the world of arts and culture that is in the Middle East. And I was part of the extended family in New York. We are an interesting tribe. We are an interesting tribe of migrants. We are an interesting tribe of translators. We are an interesting tribe who are making sense of living in a place that belongs to this kind of history of fluid exchange of ideas and shifts, often that we have little control over. It's a place of optimism, and it's a place of reinvention. Thank you so much. On to Tausif.
Thank you so much, Mahnaz. That was beautiful. So my name is Tausif, and I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural institutions today. What is their relevance and how they evolved? Over the past 4 centuries, cultural institutions have adapted to serve the needs of multiple publics, audiences, and communities. So in this 16th century engraving, we see a new form of display, the Cabinet of Curiosity. And these rooms of wonder emerged for elite consumption. And as the intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment took hold in the 18th century in Europe, art and science became ways of transforming publics instead of private individuals. So salon-style hangings became a way for publics to look at art and enrich their minds. Now, collecting art and producing culture was a way for wealthy and elite private individuals to demonstrate knowledge. So exhibitions were a way of demonstrating wealth that they had amassed from trade and actually from colonization. So there was this element of plunder and then exhibition that was involved in that. But as nation states recognized that there was a public need for institutions devoted to the exhibition of art and cultural products, again, amassed through colonization and trade for the public, institutions such as the British Museum emerged as modern ways to develop a national identity that many publics could access. Flash forward to the 21st century, and what you'll see here in the 20th century as well is multinational, large-scale museums whose activities extend way beyond exhibitions, and they include educational initiatives, public programs, and international exchange. So this is the new MoMA as seen in New York in 2019, and it takes up a whole city block. So how do we tend to the needs for public institutions to attract and engage global audiences? And what does it mean for a public to engage with a cultural institution and with art as new developments in technology, new possibilities for travel, new ways of social engagement shape the way that culture is experienced? So there are new ways that culture is experienced because we have things like social media to share what we see. In the midst of a global pandemic, our globalized collections were put into sharp relief. Cultural institutions that had long withstood many tumultuous changes now found themselves forced to adapt to a disappearing public. And the capacity for institutions to adapt varied across culture, nations, and of course, institution by institution. But what do these changes say about institutions? In the past few years, we've seen a redefinition of the term in the terms of what cultural institutions are and what they do. So the new museum in New York launched an initiative called Museum as Hub. So that emphasized the need for connection, gesturing to the capacity of the museum to serve greater functions, which are defined by where and how the institution locates itself. So multiple plural communities, as you'll see here in this selection from the Whitney. And how do we engage these communities? What initiatives do we have? As these institutions are directly impacted by the global pandemic, there have been movements for community engagement that are based on mutual aid and donating to, mobilizing the many different communities and creating change in a positive way. So you'll see here the PMA's initiative to engage audiences as part of its institutional mission for 2020 to 2021. And as communities change, cultural institutions have to respond accordingly, whether that means through technology, through different needs, such as mutual aid during the pandemic, and things like this, which is at the ICA, we've had the American Sign Language tours for those who are hard of hearing or who are deaf. And these are just some of the ways that institutions respond to change and serve the needs of their communities. I want to emphasize that change isn't always so smooth. It often has to be fought for. To be a part of culture, institutions have to be responsive to the demands of publics. And in recent years, these demands have included calls for decolonizing museums, demands for removing funders whose companies enable, for instance, the opiate crisis, demand, as seen here in Man Golden's protest at the Guggenheim, and demands for better representation, more equity for staff, more representation of artists, basically more, we want institutions to reflect the communities that they're in and attract new communities that could be part of the institution. So unionization efforts at the new museum launched actually a series of unionization efforts across museums in the US. So what we do at the ICA Philadelphia, we launched an initiative called Eyes for Institute. And Eyes for Institute attends to the constant dynamic metamorphosis of cultural institutions. So what we did was we launched a series of conversations with our peers. So we talked to museum directors, curators, institutional administrators across the world, and we attempted to investigate two central questions. What has the institution become today, and what can it be through the future? You can visit this repository of conversations and research at eyesforinstitute.icaphila.org, and this is just our homepage. These as we think about what the term institution means and what it could mean, we talk to both our publics, we talk to our peers, and we want to make this research public and accessible to all through our website, and use this as a repository for understanding what institutions can be, what they might say about us, and how we can be part of cultural too, and how institutions ultimately are made of people. And that's how we need to engage them moving forward. So thank you very much, and I will hand this over to Toral.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about how a whole series of South Asian artists imagined this question of transformation. And the one nod I have here to Kafka's Metamorphosis is the Pakistani painter Sadegh actually began his career sketching in a botany lab, and there's a little bug hovering in the background. So Sadegh took the shape of the cactus from the desert outside his window and morphed its spines into shivering penciled lines, into spider webs and crow's nests and tortured crowns. And one question that he asks us to ask is, how is it that this tangled mesh of lines can imagine the suffering subject? So those cactus branches eventually were transformed into hard concrete edges, into people and cities like this mother and child, the city of Paris, and also into the frolicking, loving letters of the Nastaliq script that you see on the bottom. Eventually, those botanical branches would morph into the modernist outline of Sadegh's retelling of the Albert Camus novel, The Stranger, the classic novel in which a Frenchman in colonial Algeria confronts his other violently through the haze of a yellow sun and sand. In Sadegh's vision, that murderous protagonist, formerly besuited with pistol in hand, is actually transformed into the malamat, the self-inflicted and self-reproaching sufferer. He's tormented by his own depravity and made vulnerable in bare feet and hands. So in the book, Sadakane's wobbling lines become a whole series of things: judgment by a jury of his peers, the long lines of the bars of the cell, the trembling fingers of the accursed who stands in self-judgment, where the only weapon, in fact, is his own hands, which indicate, of course, his guilt. Once again, we are asking how, in fact, we can torment our own selves. So the next artist I mentioned here is Nasreen Mohammadi, who was born in Karachi and migrated to Bombay, spending most of her life in Baroda with periodic trips to Bahrain, whose work asks how a network of fine lines can literally lift from the page and be transformed like a kind of object in flight. In that sense, I think her art is also asking, must we necessarily look to life for art, to the mundane for acts of creation? Or can we actually transform the work of pencil and ink into a kind of blueprint, into a map, into a maquette of futurist things to come? In her photography, you see how these tiny, tiny grains of sand are made kind of enormous and touchable. And the undulation of the sand becomes like striated fields. The lines of the ocean, the lines that crabs make in the sand, the sky and the sea produce a kind of template, which she will also use in her graphs and grids. In another series of photographs, the humble water tower of the Gulf is transformed into a kind of modernist icon, and painstakingly measured lines of ink, even while she was suffering from Huntington's disease, become like a textile, something you could actually reach out and touch, into a woven cloth. In the notes that she scribbled in her diaries, there are anagrams and acrostics, graphs and diagrams, as well as a smattering of English, Hindi, and Gujarati, a whirl of all of the potential things to come, of math equations that would eventually become futurist flying birds. So the next artist I'm mentioning here is actually a novelist and a poet called Agea, who took the pen name meaning the unknown, and he was born in an archaeological camp as his father was unearthing a Buddhist tomb. He moved from Madras to Lahore. He was imprisoned for bomb making, for anti-colonial terrorism against British rule, and he thought that the change that was going to happen to the world should come in the form of a radically experimentalist poetry. So he was intrigued by the power of the image, and his journal, pratik, or symbol, considered really the metaphysical or existential possibilities in the world of the everyday. When, for example, he would say, is a stone not simply a stone? So in his literary experiments, he wrote of shadows and ice, of the torment of a closed room and the transformation of the individual into a revolutionary, of the exquisite attention to a bird's song, and the fact that we could find infinity in a drop of water. And he goes on to ask questions that I think many of these artists are asking, which is, can the truth of the universe actually emerge in a tiny grain of sand, the kind of sand that we can touch, and all of the grains of sand that we will in fact never be able to touch? So for Agea, the art of an experimental poetry was actually in the form of transformation, but also in the form of translation. So he asks us if the vitality of an Indian art could only emerge from looking backwards, from looking to Sanskrit or Persian or Arabic, or could it emerge, in fact, in dialogue with the contemporary, with something like the Japanese haiku? And he writes about his time in Japan, watching a Japanese gardener, motionless, cutting tiny, tiny weeds and trees. So finally, the last artist I mentioned here is Syed Waliullah, Bengali novelist and playwright, born in Chittagong, living all over rural Bengal, moving from Dhaka to Karachi, from Karachi to Paris, and serving as UN ambassador in France, an occasional painter who saw the world in geometric blocks of color. So Waliullah saw also an interest in French philosophy, and he was one of the few writers who I think fought for an independent nation in multiple languages, in English, in Urdu, in Bengali, in French. And he saw in the tiniest villages a canvas for the greatest philosophical problems of our time, some of which include the secular, the profane, age and youth, and of course, life and death. And his artwork asked these interesting questions. Can the world of our daily lives, of fruits and fishing nets, of windows and screens, be transformed into a modernist collage? Can they be the subject of actual art? So Waliullah, who in the most staggering metamorphosis might be said to have lived in India, in Pakistan, and Bangladesh without ever having moved at all, finally raises for us the question of the most radical transformations which can happen when we are entirely standing still. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toral, for concluding so beautifully. Thank you, all of you, for participating tonight, for preparing this incredibly intellectually nourishing session for us and for our audiences this evening. So many incredible thoughts that I've written down in the past hour. Too many to go through in a summary, but I think certainly it feels that we are undergoing some sort of productive crisis. And it was incredible to witness a lot of questions and how you challenge various disciplines and practices through your almost plural versions of yourself that extend into institutions and other areas. So really, thank you one more time. I would like to invite our audiences to continue and engage with our program on alserkal.online, which was our own attempt to respond as an institution in times of crisis. That's now become our knowledge lab. And also you can get all our updates on our programs on all our social media platforms as well, on Al-Serkal Online. So thank you again to all of you, and we're looking forward to seeing you on our, actually I would like to maybe just remark on save the date for the season's opening at Al-Serkal next Saturday on September 19th. I hope those that are able to come and engage physically will come and visit our exhibitions then. Thank you again, and see you all soon.